The grand ballroom of the Grand Crescent Hotel sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most people earned in a year. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with expensive drinks, while a live orchestra played softly in the background. Politicians, business leaders, and wealthy investors filled the room, all gathered to celebrate one man, Richard Carter. At 60 years old, Richard was considered one of the most successful businessmen in the state. He owned multiple companies, appeared regularly in magazines, and loved reminding people how hard he had worked to build his empire. To everyone in the ballroom, Richard looked like a self-made success story. To his eldest son, Ethan Carter, he was something very different. Ethan stood outside the ballroom entrance for a moment, staring through the glass doors. He adjusted the sleeves of his simple navy blue suit. Unlike most guests, he wasn't wearing a custom-made designer outfit. His suit was clean and respectable, but ordinary, much like the life he had chosen. Growing up, Ethan had always felt like a disappointment in his father's eyes, while Richard dreamed of building a family dynasty. Ethan had never cared about wealth or prestige. He wasn't interested in boardrooms, luxury cars, or billion-dollar deals. Instead, he spent his life helping people who had nowhere else to turn. He worked long hours managing community programs, assisting struggling families, and raising funds for local shelters. The work wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. At least it mattered to him. To Richard, it was a waste of potential. Ethan could have been a CEO, Richard often told people. Instead, he chose charity work. The word charity always sounded like an insult when it came from his father. Ethan had almost ignored the invitation to the birthday celebration. Richard rarely invited him to family events anymore. Most of the time, his father acted as though he barely existed. But when the elegant envelope arrived, Ethan allowed himself a small flicker of hope. Maybe things were changing. Maybe his father wanted to reconnect. Maybe, for once, he could simply be a son attending his father's birthday. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped inside. The room buzzed with conversation. Almost immediately, he noticed familiar faces from newspapers and television. Business executives shook hands near the stage, while photographers captured every important moment. At the center of it all stood Richard Carter, smiling confidently as guests surrounded him. Beside him was Ethan's younger brother, Mason. Unlike Ethan, Mason had followed the path Richard wanted. He worked in the family corporation and was widely expected to take over one day. The comparison between the brothers had followed Ethan his entire life. Mason was ambitious, Ethan was idealistic. Mason generated profits, Ethan helped strangers. In Richard's eyes, there was no competition. Mason always won. As Ethan approached, he noticed his brother first. "Hey," Mason said with a surprised smile, "you actually came." Ethan laughed softly. "I was invited. That's what surprised me." The joke stung because it was true. Before Ethan could respond, Richard noticed him. The smile on his father's face faded almost instantly. Ethan felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said politely. Richard's eyes moved over Ethan's suit, then his shoes, then back to his face. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. "You're late," Richard finally said. The words weren't angry. They were worse, cold. "I got here as soon as I could." Richard nodded dismissively. Several nearby guests turned toward them. Ethan tried to ignore the growing attention. "I just wanted to congratulate you," he said. Richard forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Thank you." An uncomfortable silence followed. Ethan realized the conversation was already over. As he stepped back, one of Richard's business partners approached. "Richard, who's this?" the man asked. Richard hesitated. It lasted only a second, but Ethan noticed. His own father hesitated before introducing him. "This is my son, Ethan." The businessman offered a polite handshake. "Oh, the oldest son." The phrase sounded strangely familiar, as if Ethan's name carried little importance beyond his birth order. More guests joined the conversation. Questions followed. "What do you do? Do you work with the company? Which division do you manage?" Ethan answered honestly, "I work with nonprofit community programs." The reactions were immediate, polite smiles, raised eyebrows. Thinly disguised confusion. One woman nodded sympathetically, as if Ethan had admitted to being unemployed. Richard's expression darkened further. Then came the moment Ethan would never forget. A guest asked another question. "So you're not involved in the Carter businesses at all?" Before Ethan could answer, Richard sighed loudly. The sound cut through the nearby conversations. Then he spoke. "That's because Ethan has never understood success." The surrounding group fell silent. Ethan felt his face grow warm. "Dad, no." Richard interrupted. "Since everyone keeps asking, let's be honest." The crowd's attention shifted completely toward them. Richard straightened his jacket. His voice carried far beyond their circle. People spend their lives building something meaningful. Ethan chose to throw away every opportunity he was given. Several guests exchanged nervous glances. Ethan couldn't believe this was happening. Not here, not tonight, not in front of everyone. Richard looked directly at him. His eyes were filled with disappointment. And something even worse, embarrassment. Then came the words that seemed to freeze the entire ballroom. "If you're going to stand around reminding everyone of your wasted potential," Richard said coldly, "then do us both a favor." The orchestra continued playing in the distance. No one moved, no one spoke. Richard pointed toward the exit. "Leave before you embarrass me." The room went completely silent. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Ethan. Shock, pity, discomfort. He felt every gaze like a knife. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Slowly, Ethan nodded. Without saying a word, he turned toward the doors. His heart pounded with every step. The humiliation was overwhelming. But just as he reached the ballroom entrance, a calm, powerful voice echoed across the silent room. "Richard Carter," the woman said sharply, "that may be the biggest mistake you've ever made." Ethan stopped walking. And so did everyone else. Ethan froze with his hand resting on the ballroom door. The voice that had interrupted the crushing silence was calm, firm, and impossible to ignore. Slowly, he turned around. Every guest in the room did the same. Standing near the front row of tables was a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and an elegant black gown. Her posture was straight, her expression unwavering, and her reputation was known throughout the room. Margaret Wilson. Unlike many of the wealthy guests present, Margaret had earned admiration not just for her success, but for her generosity. She had donated millions to hospitals, schools, and community programs. Newspapers often called her one of the most influential philanthropists in the country. When Margaret Wilson spoke, people listened. Richard forced an uncomfortable smile. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter." "No," Margaret replied. "You made it everyone's business the moment you humiliated your son in front of this entire room." The ballroom remained silent. Richard's smile disappeared. Ethan could see uncertainty beginning to creep into his father's face. Margaret slowly stepped forward. "What surprises me," she continued, "is that after all these years you still don't seem to know who your son really is." A murmur spread through the crowd. Richard crossed his arms. "I know exactly who my son is." "Do you?" Margaret asked. The question landed like a challenge. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a man losing control of a conversation. Margaret turned toward Ethan. A warm smile appeared on her face. Ethan, I apologize for what you've just endured. You don't need to apologize, Ethan said quietly. Perhaps not, but someone should. The room grew even more attentive. Guests leaned closer. Several people discreetly pulled out their phones. They sensed something important was about to happen. Margaret faced the crowd. I've spent the last 7 years working alongside Ethan Carter. Richard frowned. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the man you just called an embarrassment. The guests exchanged confused looks. Margaret continued. Many of you know me through the Wilson Foundation. Several heads nodded. The foundation has partnered with hundreds of organizations across the country. We've helped build shelters, fund scholarships, provide medical assistance, and create housing programs. Richard looked impatient. I know all that. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Then perhaps you should know that Ethan helped create many of those programs. The room erupted into whispers. Richard blinked. What? Margaret ignored him. 3 years ago, a housing initiative saved over 400 families from homelessness during a severe economic downturn. She pointed toward Ethan. He designed that program. Several guests looked at Ethan with surprise. Margaret continued. 2 years ago, emergency scholarship funds allowed hundreds of students to remain in college after their families suffered financial hardship. Again, she gestured toward Ethan. He organized that effort. The whispers grew louder. Richard's face began losing color. That's impossible. No, Margaret said. What's impossible is that you never bothered to find out. A man standing near the stage suddenly spoke up. I know Ethan. The crowd turned. It was David Reynolds, a respected hospital director. David smiled. Our pediatric emergency fund would have collapsed during the pandemic without his help. Another voice joined in. And our veterans program. A woman near the back raised her hand. He personally visited our shelter every week. Then another. And he raised funding for our community center. More voices followed, one after another, like dominoes falling. Stories filled the room, stories Richard had never heard, stories about Ethan working late nights, stories about families receiving food, stories about children receiving medical treatment, stories about people whose lives had changed because someone cared enough to help. That someone was Ethan. Richard looked around the ballroom in disbelief. The same guests who had been admiring him moments earlier were now staring at his son with admiration. Some even applauded. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He had never sought recognition. Most of the projects had been team efforts. He didn't enjoy being the center of attention. Margaret seemed to understand. He's probably wishing we'd all stop talking about him, she said with a small smile. Laughter spread through the room. Even Ethan couldn't help smiling. Then Margaret's expression became serious again. The difference between Ethan and many successful people I've met is simple. She looked directly at Richard. When Ethan helps someone, he doesn't do it for headlines. The room fell silent once more. He doesn't do it for awards. Richard lowered his eyes. He doesn't do it for attention. Margaret paused. He does it because he genuinely cares. Those words seemed to hit harder than anything else she'd said. For the first time, Richard had no response, no argument, no criticism, no sarcastic remark, nothing. Because every person in the room could see the truth. Ethan hadn't failed. He had simply chosen a different definition of success. And judging by the respect now surrounding him, it was a definition many people admired far more than wealth. Richard looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, the confident businessman who controlled boardrooms and billion-dollar negotiations suddenly seemed lost. Ethan saw confusion, regret, and maybe even shame, but before anyone could speak again, another unexpected voice came from near the stage. A reporter lowered her phone and stepped forward. Mr. Carter, she asked carefully, Were you aware that your son is being considered for this year's National Humanitarian Award? The ballroom gasped. Richard's eyes widened. What award? The reporter looked genuinely surprised. You didn't know. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had hoped that information would remain private until official announcements were made. Apparently, that was no longer possible. The room exploded with conversation. Guests began talking all at once. Meanwhile, Richard Carter stood completely motionless. For the first time in his life, the most important person in the room wasn't him, and everyone knew it. The birthday celebration ended hours later, but the story refused to die. By sunrise the next morning, videos recorded by guests had already spread across social media. Thousands of people watched the moment Richard Carter publicly humiliated his son. They also watched the shocking revelations that followed. The internet was unforgiving. News outlets picked up the story within days. Headlines focused on the irony. Business tycoon publicly insults son before learning of his humanitarian work. Millionaire father humiliates charity leader at birthday celebration. The son he called an embarrassment has helped thousands. Richard hated every headline. For decades, he had carefully built his reputation. Every interview, every public appearance, every business deal had strengthened the image he wanted the world to see. Now that image was beginning to crack. Inside Carter Enterprises, employees whispered about the incident. At first, Richard assumed the attention would fade. It didn't. The more reporters investigated Ethan's work, the more stories emerged. Families shared testimonials. Students described how scholarships had changed their futures. Single parents talked about receiving emergency assistance when they had nowhere else to go. Veterans spoke about programs that helped them rebuild their lives. Each new story made Ethan look better, and made Richard look worse. One afternoon, Richard entered a board meeting expecting a routine discussion. Instead, he noticed unusual tension around the conference table. Several executives avoided eye contact. Others seemed distracted. Finally, one of the senior board members cleared his throat. Richard, we need to discuss the recent publicity. Richard's expression darkened. There's nothing to discuss. Actually, there is. The room became uncomfortable. The company is receiving questions from investors. Richard stared at him. Questions about what? About leadership. The words hit harder than expected. For years, Richard had been viewed as a symbol of strength and wisdom. Now people were questioning his judgment, not because of a business decision, because of how he treated his own son. That realization followed him everywhere. Restaurants, business meetings, industry events. People still greeted him politely, but something had changed. The admiration he once enjoyed felt weaker, more distant. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was moving in the opposite direction. Organizations from across the country reached out to him. Donors offered support. Community leaders requested meetings. Programs that had struggled for funding suddenly attracted new attention. Yet Ethan remained exactly the same. He continued visiting shelters, continued attending community meetings, continued helping families. The sudden fame didn't change him. That fact impressed people even more. One evening, Richard sat alone in his office reading article after article about Ethan. For years, he had convinced himself that his son lacked ambition. Now he was discovering accomplishments he never knew existed. A photograph caught his attention. It showed Ethan sitting beside a young girl in a hospital room. Both were smiling. The article explained how Ethan's fundraising efforts had helped pay for life, saving treatment. Richard stared at the image for a long time. Another article described housing programs. Another discussed educational scholarships. Another highlighted emergency relief efforts. Page after page, achievement after achievement, Richard felt something unfamiliar, guilt. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in. The office door opened. Mason stepped inside. Unlike usual, he wasn't smiling. He looked serious. Angry, even. Richard set the papers aside. "What is it?" Mason closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." Richard frowned. "About what?" "About Ethan." The room immediately became tense. Richard leaned back. "I don't want another lecture." "You're getting one anyway." Richard looked surprised. Mason rarely challenged him, not directly, but today was different. Mason stepped closer. "Do you realize what you've done?" "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Mason asked. "Dad, you've treated Ethan like he was a failure for years." Richard remained silent. Mason continued. "You compared us constantly." His voice softened. "You made him feel like he wasn't good enough." Richard looked away. The truth hurt because he couldn't deny it. Mason sighed heavily. "You know what the worst part is." Richard didn't answer. Mason shook his head. "Ethan never hated you." Those words struck like a hammer. "He always wanted your approval." Richard felt his chest tighten. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering. Mason's eyes filled with disappointment. "He kept showing up because he hoped someday you'd be proud of him." The office became painfully quiet. For the first time, Richard saw the situation through someone else's eyes, not as a businessman, not as a father with expectations, but as a son seeking acceptance and being rejected again and again. Weeks passed, the criticism continued. The attention remained, but something else happened too. Richard found himself thinking constantly about Ethan. Not about his career, not about his choices, about him, the person, the son. One rainy evening, Richard drove past one of the community centers Ethan helped operate. The parking lot was full. Families entered carrying groceries. Children laughed as volunteers greeted them. Richard parked across the street and watched silently for nearly an hour. Nobody recognized him. Nobody knew he was there. Then he saw Ethan. His son emerged from the building carrying boxes. A young boy ran toward him. Ethan smiled and knelt to listen as the child excitedly talked about something. The boy hugged him. Ethan hugged him back. Simple, natural, genuine. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. For years he had measured success through money, influence, and power. Yet standing in the rain, watching his son change lives one person at a time, he finally understood something. The son he considered unsuccessful had earned something money could never buy: respect, love, trust. And now, Richard faced a painful reality. He wanted those things too, but first, he would have to face the damage he had caused. And for the first time in his life, Richard Carter wasn't sure if he could fix it. 6 months passed after the night that changed everything. The story that had once dominated headlines eventually faded from public attention. New scandals replaced old ones. New stories filled the news cycle, but for Richard Carter, the consequences never disappeared. Every day, he was reminded of the damage he had caused. Not by strangers, not by reporters, by the empty space between himself and his son. During those months, Richard made several attempts to contact Ethan. He sent messages, made phone calls, even wrote a handwritten letter. For the first time in his life, he wasn't acting like a powerful businessman trying to solve a problem. He was acting like a father trying to repair a broken relationship. Ethan responded politely but cautiously. Years of hurt could not be erased with a few apologies. Trust had to be earned, and Richard finally understood that. Meanwhile, Ethan continued focusing on the work he loved. The attention from the birthday incident had brought new funding to dozens of programs. Shelters expanded, scholarship funds grew, more families received support. The recognition that followed wasn't something Ethan had sought. Yet it continued to find him. Then came the announcement that surprised nobody except Ethan himself. He had officially been selected as the recipient of the National Humanitarian Award. The award recognized individuals whose work had created meaningful change in the lives of others. For years, Ethan had quietly helped thousands of people. Now the entire country would hear his story. The ceremony was held in a magnificent convention center filled with community leaders, philanthropists, business executives, journalists, and government officials. Hundreds of guests attended. Thousands more watched online. Backstage, Ethan adjusted his tie nervously. Public speaking had never been his favorite activity. Helping people was easier than standing in front of a crowd. A volunteer approached him. "They're ready for you." Ethan nodded. Before walking toward the stage entrance, he glanced into the audience. Then he saw someone unexpected. Richard. His father sat alone near the back, not in a VIP section, not near the cameras. Just quietly sitting among everyone else. For a moment their eyes met. Richard offered a small, nervous smile. Ethan returned a brief nod. Nothing more, but it was enough. Minutes later, the ceremony host stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor a man whose compassion has transformed countless lives." Applause filled the room. The host continued describing Ethan's achievements, scholarship programs, emergency housing initiatives, medical assistance projects, community development efforts. The list seemed endless. When Ethan's name was finally announced, the audience rose to their feet. A standing ovation thundered through the hall. The applause lasted nearly a minute. As Ethan walked toward the stage, he caught sight of families he had helped over the years. Some were crying, others were smiling proudly. Children waved excitedly. The sight nearly overwhelmed him. After accepting the award, Ethan stepped behind the microphone. The applause slowly faded. He looked across the audience, then began speaking. "I've spent most of my life believing that success meant helping people whenever I could." The room listened attentively, not because it would earn recognition. He glanced at the award in his hands, not because it would lead to moments like this. Several audience members smiled, but because every person deserves dignity. More applause followed. Ethan continued, "I've learned something important over the years." His voice remained calm. Many people spend their lives chasing status. The statement wasn't directed at anyone, yet Richard felt every word. Others chase wealth. Ethan paused. But the most valuable thing we can leave behind is the positive impact we have on others. The audience erupted into applause again. Then Ethan grew thoughtful. "There was a time when I desperately wanted approval from people whose opinions mattered to me." His eyes briefly drifted toward his father. The audience didn't notice, but Richard did. "Eventually, I realized that our worth isn't determined by someone else's expectations." The room became silent. "It's determined by the choices we make every day." Many guests wiped away tears. Ethan smiled softly. "And if I've accomplished anything worth celebrating, it's because I was fortunate enough to meet people who taught me kindness, resilience, and forgiveness." That final word lingered in the air. Forgiveness. Richard lowered his head. For months he had carried shame. Tonight, he felt something else. Hope. The speech ended with another standing ovation. Guests rose from their seats once more. The applause seemed endless. Reporters rushed forward. Cameras flashed, but Ethan's attention was elsewhere. After the ceremony concluded, he quietly slipped away from the crowd. Outside the convention center, the evening air was cool and peaceful. A few moments later, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Richard stood there. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but Ethan had waited years to hear them. Richard's voice trembled. "I should have said it a long time ago." Ethan looked at him carefully. The arrogance that once defined his father seemed gone. In its place stood a man humbled by his mistakes. "I know," Ethan replied softly. Richard nodded. Tears filled his eyes. "I'm sorry, son. The apology was genuine. No excuses, no justifications, just regret." Ethan took a deep breath.
"I forgive you." Richard's eyes widened, but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. Richard nodded immediately. "I understand. We still have a lot to rebuild, I know." For the first time in years, a small smile appeared between them. It wasn't a perfect ending, not yet, but it was a beginning, and sometimes beginnings are more powerful than endings. Months earlier, Richard had told Ethan to leave before he embarrassed him. Now, after watching an entire room rise to honor his son, Richard finally understood the sweetest revenge of all. Ethan never needed to prove his worth. He simply lived it. And the same room that once fell silent in humiliation had risen together in thunderous applause for the son who refused to become bitter, chose kindness over resentment, and showed everyone, including his father, what true success really looks like.